Good morning. I'm Athina Vitopoulou. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Architecture here in the Aristotle University. And I welcome you to Thessaloniki, to Aristotle University, and also to this workshop. Όταν είναι αυτό το κόκκινο, είναι recording.
Είναι stop share.
Όχι, το κόκκινο αυτό το κόκκινο.
Τέλεια.
Να ανοίξω βίντεο. Δεν είναι αυτό. Sorry, a technical problem. Ας το σκεφτούμε, δεν πειράζει. So, I thought that maybe you would like, well, I know that you have a lot of work to do in 3 days, but these 3 days, also I know that you, in the program, there is, you're going to have a visit in the campus and also a visit in the case study site. But I also hope that you will have the time to go around the city a little bit. So I thought that it would be nice to, to tell you, not in detail, but to present you a little bit the history of the city, just to know a few things, just to draw your attention, in fact, in order to have, to draw you to go and visit it, and also some, some things also about the university. So Aristotle University, in fact, it's the biggest university in Greece, although we're in the second city of Greece, mainly because it gathers all the disciplines together. So we have here 11 faculties and 42 departments, we would say, or schools. I don't know, it's, as you like or as you call it. So here, this is an aerial photo of the university campus. And what is interesting with this campus is that although, it is a campus, on the other hand, it's very close to the city center. So always the life of the university life is very much, interwoven with the life of the city, with the city life. And also the history of, of the formation of the university campus is really interwoven with the history of the city. And I will talk to you about that a little bit further in the presentation. I don't know why it doesn't go, although I can't, I press the button, but it doesn't. Why? Ah, okay. Sorry. I have to. Ah, okay. Thank you. Also a view from where we can see you can see the city, and especially the upper town of the city, which is, the oldest part, which remained untouched from a great fire that destroyed the city center in the beginning of the 20th century. And in the foreground, we can see in the university. Well, Thessaloniki, as you may know, is a city with a very long history, of 23, almost more than 23 centuries. And what is very interesting is that, in fact, it constitutes an urban palimpsest. Going around in the city, you can see that, a lot of archaeological findings, especially dating from the Hellenistic and the Byzantine period, they are really within the urban fabric, and it's part of the life of the citizens. So, as I told you, Thessaloniki has a very long history. It was founded by Cassandros, which was the brother-in-law of Alexander the Great, in the 3rd century before Christ. It had a continuous history, we would say, throughout all these centuries. Here you can see the Roman Salonika, which in fact, it was the Galerius decided to make it a very glorious city. So he constructed all this big complex with the palace, the hippodrome, the rotunda, which still remains today. And you can see all these findings along this central axis, which is very close to the university. I mean, in 2 minutes on foot, you can arrive to Rotunda. And also the Forum Romanum a little bit farther in the city center. During the Byzantine period, as you can see, a lot changed in the urban tissue because the main, transformation, the main change, it was that we had the Christianism who arrived in the city. So all the big monumental complexes, they were disappeared a little by little, gradually. Many churches, Christian churches, they appeared in the city from the 6th century onwards. And we have some of very important Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki that take part also of the UNESCO heritage. And here are some of the findings that were discovered lately during the metro construction. In fact, it was the 2 main roads, the crossroad of the 2 main roads in the Byzantine, dating from the Byzantine era. Of course, Thessaloniki also was conquered by the Ottomans, and for almost 4 centuries it was under the Ottomans. In fact, Thessaloniki was integrated in the Greek state almost 1 century after Athens. So the Greek state, it was until during the whole 19th century, it was until the middle of the Greece, until Thessaly. So the whole North Greece was annexed to the Greek state at the 2 first decades of the 20th century. So during the Ottoman period, also the image of the city was transformed, especially because most of the churches were transformed into mosques. So we have all these these minarets that they started to appear in the city. But what is important to understand is that until the end of the 19th century, the city was confined into its walls. It was a small city confined into its walls, and it was forbidden to construct outside the walls. So here you can see a plan dating from the end of the 18th century, and you can see this organic tissue of the city, and that there is nothing outside the walls. We have also some very interesting Ottoman monuments in the city. This is, for example, is the Bezesteni, the closed market, where all the luxury things were sold, especially the silk and the gold, and some hammams that, of course, now they are, like museums. They are not hammams now. As I told you, until the end of the 19th century, the city was confined in its walls. And another interesting aspect of the organization of the city, and to understand, the structure of the city, it was that, as in all Ottoman cities, the different ethno-religious groups were living in different districts in the city. In the upper part here of the city were the Muslims. Here they were living the Christians, the Greeks, and in the center, near to the market, it was the Jewish quarters. So we have to say that, in fact, the Jewish population in Thessaloniki during the whole Ottoman period, it was the biggest population. There were around 60,000 Jews in Thessaloniki, and they came from Spain. In fact, they arrived in the city in the 15th century after they were after the king of Spain, threw them away from Spain. So the Sultan let them come to the Ottoman Empire. So in Thessaloniki, there were about 60,000 Jews, and there were about 45,000 Muslims and 40,000 Greeks, in fact, Christians. So this is a picture of the city at the beginning of the 20th century. We can see that it was a dense city. We can also see that, in fact, all the visitors of that period, they describe it as a dense but very lively city. The architecture is more or less this traditional kind of architecture that we can see everywhere in the Balkans from that period, dated from that period. These some images from the upper part of the town, where the Muslim quarter, the Muslim district in the upper town, and on the bottom you can see the market, where in fact it was the place where all the ethno-religious groups met each other, because if not, it wasn't allowed to marry each other or to be friends or something like that. They were, every ethno-religious community had a life of its own. They had their own language, they were dressing differently, but at the market, it was the meeting place, the melting pot of the city, we could say. So at the end of the 19th century, we have the first attempts to modernize the city, and it was during, in fact, this period of the Ottoman reforms, as we call it. It's known as Tanzimat, this period. And here you can see all the different operations that they took place at the end of the 19th century in order to modernize the city. In fact, this whole period of reforms, it was about mostly about administrative and social reforms, but all these, efforts, they were seen also in the urban space, especially what changed, in fact, what was a big transformation of that period is that for the first time, all people, they had the right to become landowners, because before the whole land belonged to the Sultan. So from the moment that they could, they could invest on the land, the city began to change. It's normal, that's the urban history, it's not only Thessaloniki. So the biggest operation was that the east part of the east wall and of the west wall, they were destroyed, and so the city could expand outside the city walls. We have also the destruction of the demolition of the sea walls. So for the first time, the city opened itself to the sea, and we have the creation of this new quay that you see here, and of course they are the most expensive plots also they were created. We have the opening and the widening, we could say, of the most important roads in the city, and also of course the modernization of the infrastructure of the port, and the arrival of the train of the Fair, I don't remember in English. And also we have the reconstruction of a whole part of the city center, which was destroyed by a fire in 1890, and it was replanted by using, in fact, this orthogonal plan, in fact, with wider roads and a biggest percentage of public space in relation to the public space of the old city. I will pass some card postals in order to see a little bit these transformations that happened at the end of the 19th century. Here is the key. Here is, you can see here there was the east wall that it was demolished, and the first extension towards the east. And of course, there was also an extension towards the west. This was the first boulevard at the end of the 19th century, which in fact also had this facade ordonnance, as we say, for them in the same facade for all the buildings. It was constructed on Sultanic land, and that's why we were calling all these, this row of buildings were called Sultanic buildings, although they didn't belong to the Sultan. Here in this plan, you can see the opening, the widening of the main roads. the first square of the city. In fact, it's an opening at the end of the main commercial road, the Liberty Square, a square of only 18 meters wide, but in fact, it was the first real square as we know it in the Western, we could say, cities, because before, in the traditional Ottoman city, there weren't squares of this kind. And in this plan, you can see the first extensions that I told you towards the west, in the west part, which was in fact for the, it was new quarters that they were constructed especially for the lower social strata, and also the new district here that began to develop in the country, as it was called, where all rich people of Thessaloniki, independently of their religions, the Muslim, Jewish, or Christians, when they had money, they were going and they were buying land here in the east part of the city along this main road, and where many beautiful mansions were constructed. This is the part of the city that was reconstructed after the fire, as I told you, this orthogonal plan, and so the first new European-style buildings appeared in the city with three-story house used and also made by stone, although before, most of the buildings were made by wood, and that's why there were many fires that destroyed parts of the city during the centuries. So this was the new European-style district where also the richest people had only the opportunity to buy these new buildings. And of course, what is also interesting to note is that during these last decades of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the importance of the different communities in creating this new image of the city, because it wasn't only the Turkish administration, the Ottoman administration that started to construct new premises. For example, here you can see the Central Administration building, but also, or here the Ottoman School of Administration, both designed by Vitaliano Boselli, who was a known Italian architect that designed some nice buildings in Thessaloniki at the end of the 19th century, but also the other communities, the Jewish and the Greek community, started to construct their own big premises. For example, here we can see an orphanage, hospitals, things like that, in order to help their community. This is the new custom building. And also, of course, we have new types of uses and buildings, building types that they arrived in the city, the hotels or big commercial. This is, for example, the first store department. And it was the first building made by concrete in Thessaloniki, and a part of it was destroyed after the fire of the 1970, who destroyed the city center, as I told you. And this is the east part where I told you this was the district of the rich people at the end of the 19th century, and some beautiful, we would say, mansions. They are still there, and they all today they have been transformed either to museums, either to administrative services. And here is the Seif Aluk mansion by Bernidis, the Kapanji mansion. They are all they are all in the Vasilis Solva Street, which leads to the airport. If you came by plane, apparently you came by this main road that leads to the city center, and on both sides we have some of these mansions that they still remain today. And of course, as I told you, also the modernization of the infrastructure. Here we have some pictures of the construction of the port docks in the turn of the century. So the new port that now has been transferred since the end of the 1990s has been, it's open to the public. And if you go there, we have the photography museum, we have some nice cafes or restaurants, and with a very nice view to the city. Or other buildings infrastructural buildings, and of course the introduction of the modern factory at the end of the 19th century. Also industry arrives in the Ottoman Empire, and here we have the first factory of the city, the flour mill Alatini, which is still standing in the east part of the city. So in fact, in the 1912, the city, as I told you, after 2 Balkan wars, etc., and during the First World War, was annexed to the Greek state, and Thessaloniki became Greek, we would say. But in fact, it wasn't Greek. It was still a city, a cosmopolitan city, with, as I told you, with a population, with a prevailing Jewish population, and also Muslim population, and a part of a Christian population. So Thessaloniki was became very important for the East Front during the First War, and around 200,000 soldiers, English and French soldiers, were seized in Thessaloniki, and all this west part outside the city was transformed into a camp, into a big camp. And also this part in the east, where the first airport also of the city was created by the alliances, by the alliance. So during this very difficult, we could say, historical moment, during the war, with all these soldiers, that they doubled, in fact, the population of the city. The population was 160,000, and almost, as I told you, 200,000 soldiers also, they were here. In the August of 1917, a big fire, this is an aerial photo before the fire, a big fire started. It was very hot. There was a wind, so they couldn't. There was a lack of water, so they couldn't save. We could say the city, and almost the 2/3 of the city center was destroyed during the fire. And this gave the opportunity, we could say, to the Greek administration to really change the image of the city, to reconstruct it totally according to a new plan, and to wipe out the old traditional Ottoman structure, as they called it, Ottoman structure. They had to wipe out the past. And only the big monuments were retained. So this is the plan that shows the part of the city that was destroyed by the fire. And in fact, at that time, it was in the city, in the Armée de l'Orient, it was Ernest Ebrard. It's a famous French architect who had studied in the École des Beaux-Arts, and he was here. He has also many knowledge on the archaeological things of the city. During he was doing his services, in fact, his military service, in fact, he was leading some excavations in the city. So he was very well aware of the past of the city. And they put him in head of a big committee that it was assigned to this committee to redesign the city and to make a new plan. So here you can see the plan of the 1980 for, the whole city, although only the part for the city center, in fact, was approved and it was implemented. Of course, if you see the plan, it is, it transfers, we could say, all the town planning principles of that period in Thessaloniki. We have all these monumental axes, all the city beautiful, principles with the big axes, with the green system that surrounds the city. And what is important to note is that Ebrard, in fact, tries to make all the Byzantine, but also the Ottoman monuments as the focal points from where the big axis starts and ends, in fact. So and it's the first time that somebody told us in Greece that it's not only the ancient period that counts, but also the Byzantine period and also the Ottoman period, because the whole 19th century in the south of Greece, they were destroying everything that dated from the Ottomans and the Muslims, etc. And you can understand why, I imagine. And so it was the first time that he said that no, all these, they are part of the past of the city, so we have to enhance them. So we have all these classical syntheses with the main axis, the diagonals, the monuments as focal points, and the creation, of course, of public spaces. Another interesting, another interesting element of the plan is the creation of the civic center, which was a city beautiful principle. So the city, and he placed the civic center of the city, in fact, where the ancient Roman Forum was. Well, at that time, they didn't know that, but we can understand that he knew that via his research, archaeological research. So this is the civic center drawn by a Brar. We have the green belt around the walls, and also here, as you can see, a monumental synthesis of a big municipal park, which contained also here, you see, the university campus. So for the first time, the university appears in the plan of the city at the beginning of the 20th century, like, a group of a complex of buildings just outside the city walls. This is the main square on the sea, the Aristotle Square of today. You have to go there if you haven't already been there, with a nice view towards the Olympus, the Olympus Mount. And also he tried to impose a certain Neo-Byzantine style for the buildings surrounding the whole important monuments, but finally this was implemented only in the Aristotelus axis, which is in the heart of the city. And of course, another modernizing element of the plan is that it introduced the type of the apartment block in the city. Until then, there were only private mansions, only private houses, and with this plan, the apartment building arrived in the life of the city, we could say. This is the Aristotelus axis in the heart of the city, where, in fact, these facades, this Neo-Byzantine style, as he called it, was imposed, although he had proposed that for all the squares and all the main roads surrounding the monuments. Here you can see a plan in this Aristotelus axis, the old, tissue with the new one on it. And along this axis, we have, before we arrived to the civic center, which today here is the Roman Forum. Finally, it was never realized, this civic center, because when they started to excavate the whole place after the Second World War in order to construct these administrative buildings, they discovered the Roman Forum, so everything stopped, and now it's an archaeological site. And what is interesting also is that near to this civic center, he had placed, in fact, the main city market, the marketplaces, and we have the belly, we could say, of the city just on the noble axis of the city, the bazaars, which was a kind of oriental element that he tried to preserve from the old traditional city. Here you can see the transformations of the urban fabric, and what is very striking is that the percentage of the unbuilt space and how it grew it after the replanning of the city. This is an aerial photo that shows us that until the end of the interwar period, I mean, the part of the city which had been destroyed, in the part of the city that had been destroyed, the Ebrar plan had been implemented, except the civic center, which, as I told you, after the World War, here the Roman Forum was discovered, so everything stopped. And for many, many decades, the town hall and the justice court and the courts were looking for a plot in order to construct a building for the town hall and the courts. But it hadn't been implemented, the plan, in all this part of the city, which hadn't been destroyed by the fire. And this happened little by little after the Second World War. Some images from the interwar period in order to see this kind of eclecticism, and also of, I mean, we had also some Art Deco buildings during the, and some preserved interwar buildings that you can find, and we can see by going around in the city center on the Tsimsky Street, which is the main road, also in Egnatia Street, but also behind, I mean, a little bit farther on the north. What marked, in fact, the transition of the city and from being a cosmopolitan city to a really Greek city, it was, and this happened after the arrival of the Greeks, after the catastrophe that happened in the Asia Minor in 1922, and after the exchange of population in 1923 with Turkey. So in the end of the 1922, 150, almost 50,000 people came from Asia Minor in Thessaloniki. I mean, in the whole Greece, it was around 1 million people. But in Thessaloniki, we know that it was almost 120,000. And as you can see in this plan, all these new refugee settlements were created at this period in order to shelter all these people that they arrived in the city. So the Muslim population left, about 45,000 people. 100 and more Greeks came from the Asia Minor. And what happened to Jewish population? Well, in fact, during the interwar period, almost 20,000 Jews left the city in order to go to other Western European countries, especially in France and in Paris. But until the Second World War, the Jewish community was, I mean, very important in Thessaloniki, although, I mean, most of the population had to leave the city center, especially the poor Jewish population, because the richest, they again, I mean, bought the new plots in the city center, but the poorest people, they had to go away. And so all these, I mean, the refugee rehabilitation, as we call it, all these programs of the refugee rehabilitation almost doubled the surface of the city. Here you can see some images of this. But what really changed and transformed totally the image of the city, it's the mass reconstruction after the Second World War. This is an aerial photo of the 1951. You can see that almost nothing had changed. We have the city center, which had been reconstructed according to the Ebrar plans. We have the old city here that hadn't been transformed because at this part, the Ebrar plan hadn't been implemented. And we had this, I mean, extension in the east extension of the city, but which is still very, I mean, not so densely populated. Well, after the Second World War, we have really a rapid growth in the 50s, but especially in the 60s and the 70s. And the whole, I mean, reconstruction of the inner city took place via a peculiar, we would say, housing production mode, which is called anti-parochi. It's in fact with this procedure, the owner of a plot concedes the plot to the constructor. The constructor doesn't have to pay him from the land, but at the end, it gives him a percentage of the constructed building. This in Greek, we called it anti-parochi. So you give something and I give you something else. It's from this, it comes from these words. So we have the mass reconstruction of the city center of the inner cities, not only Thessaloniki, also in Athens and also in all the biggest Greek cities. And the replacement of the, interwar period or of the 19th century period buildings by these multi-story apartment buildings that, of course, they multiplied, they densified the city. Well, some images to understand the differences. Oh, I don't know what happened, sorry. Okay, sorry. I pushed a button that I didn't have to push. And also some interesting images from the transformation, from this transition period, when we have this coexistence of the old traditional buildings near to the monument. This is the Rotonda, and the new modern apartment buildings that started to arrive. You can see the difference in the analogy. And what, in fact, changed a lot in the city, it was, in fact, this proportion and the analogy between the open space and the built space, because although the width of the roads remained the same, and it was the same for the city center, we had the fourth or the fifth times the highest buildings, and this, of course, created all the problems of the modern city. Here you can see, for example, the transformation of the Podromiou Street. It's also a very central road in the city center. The Aristotelus axis with the post-war buildings now, and not with the interwar period buildings. And if we want to say two words, not for the inner city, but for the outskirts, I would say that in the post-war period, what was, the main option for the lower strata to acquire a shelter, it was the unauthorized settlements as the main option. They didn't have another option. They couldn't have access to the market because, to buy an apartment, it was expensive. There wasn't any public policy, for example, to construct, I'll show you, but also Vasilis Kolonas will talk about that tomorrow, to construct big, housing complexes for the people in need. So the only option was the unauthorized settlements at the outskirts of the city. All this rural population that was coming during the 50s and the 60s, they were buying a plot in the outskirts of the city, where they were building without permission, in fact, because it was on land that it wasn't integrated into the city plan. So it wasn't permitted, it wasn't allowed to build in these plots, in these land, but they were building anyway. And of course, there was a whole process of normalization and legalization of all these areas, especially after the 1970s and especially during the 1980s. There were only a small number of public social housing projects for these lower social strata. I won't talk to you about that because tomorrow Vasilis Kolonas will talk to you about this. I just wanted to have an idea, to see the general context in order to better understand the case studies that Vasilis will present you tomorrow. So we have a small number, around 10, this kind of complexes in the outskirts of the city again, but they weren't able. In fact, the number was small, and also their size was small, and they didn't manage, in fact, to influence neither the form of the city or to solve, of course, the big problem of acquiring a house especially for the lower, but also the middle social strata. So another important thing is that after the Second World War, there was a big, 2 or 3, I would say, big projects, modernizing projects, that they, in fact, formed the modern image of the city. The one was the creation of Aristotle University in the place, in the location that Ebrar had had put in his plan. Also the creation of the Thessaloniki International Fair, which is the grounds just on the south of the university, and of course the construction of the new quay, which in fact was rehabilitated also in the last 20 years, and you have to go absolutely there and see this new quay. So, as I told you, the history of the university, I mean, the university campus is really interwoven with the history of the city. Here you can see some plans, some cards, postals of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where you can see this whole area where the university campus stands now. In fact, most of its part, it was part of the Jewish cemetery, which, and in fact, in the Ebrar plan, it was, it was previewed that the cemetery was going to, to go outside the city, and there were many discussions between the administration and the Jewish community, what we are going to do, etc., etc. But nothing happened until during the whole interwar period. In fact, in this, I'll come back later, in this area, there was a non-authorized refugee settlement that was created, and here is the cemetery, and here is the unauthorized settlement that was created, and everybody thought that in fact the university was not going to be constructed. But during the Nazi occupation, in fact, the Nazis destroyed the Jewish cemetery, and so after the war, we could say that, the road was opened in order to construct the university. There was a second plan, of Ebrar's for the university campus at the end of the 1920s. But of course, as it was never realized, and we had to wait until the end, of the war, and just after the Second World War to start to construct the here is a plan that shows the different, how you can say, ownerships of the land where the university stands. With the red is the part of the Jewish cemetery that, in fact, and a part of it is where the university was constructed. So, after the Second World War, they decided to, with the money of the Marshall Plan, they decided to start the construction of the university. But of course, they didn't implement the Ebrar plan because it was outdated, and they followed, a more modern movement, we could say, approach to make the campus, to construct the campus. And here you can see some aerial photos of the 60s, and then of the 70s, while all these complexes, the modern movement complexes, were being constructed little by little in order to have all these university campus. At the foreground, we can see the International Fair. And this is the campus in the 1980s, and some of the most important complexes is the main university, the main administration building with the School of Law and Economics. They were all designed by famous Greek architects that were mostly of modern movement, we could say, architects of that period. Mitsakis and then Karantinos, the Asteroskopio. When you go around, you can see all these buildings. Of course, today they have many problems. They are degraded. There are many problems, especially also from their, energetic and energy aspect. And I will just close this finally big lecture. I didn't want it to last so much, but by saying two words about the modern urban landscape of the new quay. In fact, after the Second World War, there was the decision to construct a big quay here, a new, because the old one, it was in the city center around here, but in the east part. So they started to construct it in the 1950s. We could say that it was in fact part of a military plan, because the NATO wanted to construct this in order to be able to arrive with their big ships there. And And it's interesting because they implement a different, they adopted a different typology. We don't have, for example, these closed urban blocks that we have in the city center, or either the discontinued urban block, but we have a kind of modern movement freestanding buildings here in this hall, along this here, but with a more dense approach, we could say, because the buildings are very close to each other. Some images and pictures during the construction. Here you can see, for example, it had arrived. It wasn't, totally constructed. It was only the part of it, and this got continued until the end of the mid 1970s. And so by this picture, I would just want to make some points about, in fact, to tell you that in Greece, in fact, the middle class mass housing, it wasn't the normal, we could say, big housing estates and complexes that were constructed in the Western Europe, but it was this kind of anti-parochi system with polykatοικίες, the multi-story apartment buildings. And this is our biggest problem now. What we are going to do with this degraded building stock in a very dense urban fabric. Here, from the one side, I tried to gather a little bit of the problems of this housing stock that we have, and in the other, in the second, column, I have put the problems of the social housing complexes. So we have, from the one side, a degraded housing stock in dense urban fabric. On the other side, we have a degraded building stock, but in less dense urban fabric, and that's where you're going to work. We have an unfavorable proportion of built and unbuilt spaces. On the other hand, we have a favorable proportion of built and unbuilt space. Distances between buildings that do not allow for proper insulation and ventilation. So we have unfavorable conditions towards passive energy solutions. On the other hand, we have favorable conditions towards passive energy solutions. We have degraded, few in number and small in size public spaces. Well, in the social housing complexes, we have degraded but large public spaces. We have, on the one hand, small percentage of green spaces and large percentage of green spaces on the other hand. We have an intense land use mix in the whole city to the point of incompatibility sometimes. On the other hand, we have mainly monofunctional areas resulting to lack of livability in the public space as a result of the lack of ground floor commerce that exists in the whole city. And of course, on the one side, we have heavy traffic within the residential area, which is unfavorable towards walking. On the other hand, we have less traffic and more favorable conditions towards walking. But in both cases, I would say, if I could, summarize, and with that, I will end my presentation. If we have to put together some parameters in order to think or to discuss for the redesign of sustainable residential areas, either of the one morphology or the other, of course, we have to think about restructuring, de-densification or densification, according to the urban morphology. We have to talk about the density, the organization and layout of the urban blocks, the mix of uses, the diversity, the active facades, which is very important, the energy functional and aesthetical upgrading and or reuse of the building stock, of course, the bioclimatic design with passive forms, renewable energy sources, photovoltaics, etc. Distances between buildings, the open space between buildings and what we can do about that, either if it's big or if it's small. The relationship of the built environment with the private unbuilt spaces, these traditional or intermediate spaces that we have in some cases, not everywhere, but in some cases. Of course, the green and blue infrastructure and the role of vegetation, both in macro and micro scale. The livability of the public space by trying to provide a diversity of outdoor activities. Of course, ensuring thermal, visual, and acoustic comfort in these open spaces. the accessibility, which is very important, the accessibility for everybody, and all these sustainable mobility networks that we have to create. And last but not least, the urban metabolism issues, that is the energy, the water, the waste, the food, with all these new, approaches of better, water management, as the water sensitive urban design, or the recycling of the waste, etc. And I will end here my presentation. I hope that it wasn't very, tiring for you. I just wanted to make an introduction to Thessaloniki and to the main problems that we have here. But also to make you have the, to attract your attention in order to make some walks in the city, in order to see all this. I hope that you will have the time, of course, because you have also a lot of work to do. Thank you. I think that I took the time of your coffee, but I hope that you can have it the break. If there is any questions, if you want to clarify something, or want me to clarify something, or
well, first of all,
Athina, yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's amazing.
Thank you.
For us, for me, it's the first time in Thessaloniki you have covered the historical issues and at the same time the urban and the architectural ones. So thank you so much for this. And I have some curious questions. And another more specifically regarding the housing and the last slide.
Okay.
So first of all, because we have some kind of similar problems, not so strong. How you deal in our days? How you deal with archaeological funds and the urban planning issues? So because just go around yesterday afternoon at the city, I think I felt that it's still a problem. And I know that I imagine that answer it's not really, but how you found during this period since the beginning that how you deal, how you get on the strategies to deal with this. And after one of the questions that you answered in the end, that it's about the modern movement. It's impressive. I think it's small quantity, but very good examples of modern movement that you show. But what I could understand so far, I could understand they are very located they are located in a specific point of the city. So and that it's also interest regarding the developing of the city. And for the last questions or issues that I want to highlight is that I really appreciate the screen that we have, the slide that we have, the people there, the middle class and the social housing, the middle class housing and the social housing, because I think for the most of the people and the first impressions that we have is the housing for the middle class. It's better than the social housing. That is as the most of the countries. And we are starting to realize that it's not so true that we saw in the beginning, for instance, of this research project. And we realize that here very well. Regarding the green spaces, everything is almost the opposite. And that it's very easy and how to cross it to do it. So it's there.
Yeah. Well, I will start for the first, but I don't think that I could thoroughly answer because we would have to make a conference about that. So, in fact, it was it used to be a very big problem in until 2 decades ago. I mean, then the whole post-war period, because the archaeologists were really very old-dated about the town planning, about that they didn't want to touch anything, they didn't want to do anything, they just wanted to dig and dig and dig. So it was very difficult. And this, what you see in the city today, it's mostly the result of this period. In the last 2 decades, I mean, from the 2000 onwards, we can say that how would you say, in some, but very little places, when we discover now findings, they integrate them in the buildings, so we have some more, I mean, contemporary approach about that. But the big archaeological sites are there and they are in the city. So what we haven't, I think, managed to do until now, it's to integrate, I mean, although the archaeological findings, the archaeological site is there, is an open space, sometimes it is used as an open space. For example, sometimes of the years, the Roman Forum is open, we can go there even to eat and to have a picnic and things like that. But this is exceptional. Most of the time, it's like an enclave in the city and only the tourists go inside to visit the site. But at least it's good that we have this open space, because otherwise it's sure that we would have constructed on that. That's sure in Greece. So I also when, for example, we have a square at the west part of the city center that since the 1990s remains, I mean, an excavated place. It's not, I mean, an archaeological site that you can visit, I mean, as the Forum Romanum or other sites or in the Navarino, but it's, I mean, closed for the, and they started to excavate that because they wanted, although there was a very beautiful Art Deco square, it was the only Art Deco square in Thessaloniki, they destroyed it because the then mayor wanted to construct an underground parking space. The archaeologists, they were saying, if you dig, you will never do that. Because, so she dug the place, and then of course it's been 40 years now that the archaeologists just keep doing research. And of course, no square, no, and no archaeological site, I mean, for visitors until then. So it is a big problem. You know, also there is all this discussion about the metro. The metro in Thessaloniki. It's a joke. It's a joke because it's been 30 years that we're constructing the metro. You know, in Athens, they constructed it in 5 years, although also there, everything you dig, you find answer because it was the Olympic Games. So everything went, you know, down very quickly. The archaeologists couldn't do anything at all because there were certain laws related to the preparation for the Olympic Games and so on. But in Thessaloniki, we didn't have Olympic Games. So it's been 30 years now that we're constructing the metro. And especially this place, this site that I showed you where they found the crossroad of the main roads from the dates from the pre-Byzantine era. I mean, they were also, you know, every mayor, I mean, the mayor that we had before, it was against to destroy that, and he wanted to construct the metro, but without taking away the archaeological findings. Then the other mayor tried to change all that, and he said, no, because he is a civil engineer himself. So he said, no, there is no solution in order to do that. So we will take away the archaeological findings. We are going to construct the station, and then we will put them back. So this changed, I mean, it's 10 years now. I mean, for 10 years, they were trying to decide and they were changing opinions. And I mean, we still wait for the metro to be constructed, although most of the stations are ready and they could be open to the public, etc. So it is a big problem, but I think it's the same problem as in, I mean, in Italy, in Spain, in France, also in Portugal. I mean, it's very difficult. It's the problem of all these, I mean, cities with all this very heavy past, we could say, and so we have to find ways to coexist, for these things to coexist. And also the archaeologists, they have to modernize themselves a little bit. It's happening, In Greece, it's happening, but it's only been, I mean, 10 years, something like that, 15 years. Now you can talk with them a little bit better than before. I hope there isn't any archaeologist in the room. So about the other thing that you said, I'm not sure that I remember well, but yeah.
And the question is, you realize that it's not the same in all the countries. So we have to, and for that, in my opinion, it's so important what you are doing about the mapping and how exactly or more which context we have in each country. But the question is here in Greece, because we already heard about the anti-corruption and what is behind it. So, in your opinion, you see that the problem that you are dealing with the middle-class housing came from the anti-corruption?
Yeah, not from the big housing estates, public estates. No, it's the private. I mean, it's almost the opposite of the problem that there is in the rest of the European cities, you know, most of the cities. Because here, also, this is, I mean, here, the massive reconstruction after the Second World War was left in the hands of the private sector. So, because the country had spent all the money, especially of the Marshall Plan, from military reasons, because we had also, you know, the civil war after the World War, etc. So, I mean, and the little money were only put on infrastructure and also some big projects, such as the University of the UK and things like that. And in Athens, it was the same. So the whole reconstruction program, it was left on the private initiative. So they found this, it was clever, and he was very clever, because it created the middle class in Greece. Because everybody that had a small house, of, I don't know, a small house that he had inherited from his mother, father, etc., with two-story house, she ended up to have 4 or 5 apartments and one shop on the ground floor. So even if the salaries weren't very big, I mean, and we had always this problem, they had, I mean, a second salary from renting this, and a second income, you can say, from renting this. So it was, I mean, it was the process not only to reconstruct the city, but also to create, to solve the problem, the housing problem in the post-war period. And also it created the middle class in Greece. So the result was, in fact, to resolve the social problem, but not the spatial problem, because it created, you know, it's this, this contradiction between the two. But now our problem is mostly what we are going to do with all this housing stock, which is private, which is, I mean, you have, I don't know how many, I mean, millions of landowners. And it's not so easy. And in every, I mean, polykatekia, you have almost 20 or 25, or I mean, from 15 to 25 owners. So it's not so easy to do anything. Even if you want, for example, to get in this program to ameliorate, I mean, the energy of the building and things like that, it's not so easy, because one says, I don't have money, the other says, but I have, and it's not so easy. So, and also the conditions of the urban space that we have created through this mechanism are not favorable enough. You can't really do many things, because you don't have a big open space, you don't have what can you do? For example, in the other case, you can do whatever you want. You have a lot of space. You can put a new, I don't know, new facade. You can densify the whole complex, things like that. You have options. You start from better conditions. Although the housing stock is degraded, okay, I understand that. Also in Greece and in this social housing complexes is the same. But as we try to work on that in our studio the last year, we saw that we have many options in this case. Well, you have to have a lot of money, but you have options at least. In the other case, you don't have a lot of options. I don't say that you can't do anything. Of course you can do. You can do some things, for example, with the inner space of the urban blocks. We have the planning tools, although they were never implemented in Greece. We have the tools to do that. But it's not so easy to go on with that.
I have the last one. For instance, the collective spaces and collective spaces, green spaces, in these private neighborhoods, who take care of them?
It's the municipality. No. But it wasn't very clear in the first years that these complexes were created. Well, in the rest of the city, it's the municipality. But in these housing complexes, for many years, it wasn't very clear. Because these complexes, in fact, they were given the ownership of the flats to the people that were to the inhabitants, but for the open space, it was, I mean, for the beginning of the first years, they were saying that it belonged to the Ministry of Welfare that had constructed that. Then at a certain point, they decided to give it to the municipality. But I don't know, 20 years passed until they decided to give it to the municipality. So as you can understand, I mean, things go very slowly here in Greece, in the urban planning issues. So it's because now it belongs to the municipality. No. And there is the municipality who owns the open space, or is okay. Not all, but in the majority. Okay.
Buildings or in the most protected are even the buildings are and it's not
Thank you for the questions.
Very much for the presentation. In fact, I was highly impressed with the presentation because since I have a master in architecture and research architecture at Istanbul Technical University, with a lot of correlation about the urban development of the city from a historical perspective, and also the continued transformation from different period to the other period, and especially I found a lot of similarities in the cases of Turkey, but also probably because in Tirana, Albania, we're following Greece by about 20 years. So they're facing similar problems now because now the city is being transformed in the same principles of the guys that are owning the house. They're giving the land and the house, and another developer is providing an apartment or residential complexes.
Unfortunately, they discovered antiparochi. They took it from us. Unfortunately for them, Unfortunately for them.
I think probably maybe it might be also related to the Ukrainian part, but probably. But, so it was very interesting, especially looking to the historical background of Thessaloniki or Thessaloniki. I find I also make some correlations and connect the puzzles, especially in this westernization struggles of the late period, Ottoman period, because when I was a student, many professors were telling that, well, the Ottomans would invest in the Balkans for some things, but I found it not very logical because in our side we didn't have such a thing. But I realized that in some extent looking to the, because I knew that Thessaloniki was a really very big city. We're probably the second city.
Yes, we are always the second. It's
Yeah.
our, we were the second after Istanbul, now we are the second after Athens.
I've been living in the very city center of the city and the whole of the very city center and also the urban issue and also the exterior of the buildings as well. And also I realized this art deco building.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very similar to the region of this neighborhoods around Istanbul, which in fact there were a lot of Greek residentials there, but I think due to the agreement between countries and sometimes excels, unfortunately, they were being back and forth.
Yeah.
It was very impressive and very, very nice. Thank you for this presentation.
Thank you for your good words, your comments.
I can say it's not about architecture.
Okay.
About the next Thessaloniki, I saw that you write it differently than 4 years ago with an S and now with the H.
No, in fact, in Greek, it's Thessaloniki with a theta. You know Spanish with a theta. So it's Thessaloniki. It was the name of the sister of Alexander the Great, Thessaloniki. And it was his husband that founded the city, so he gave the name of his wife to the city. So if you want to make the transliteration from Greek to English, you have to, the theta, we write it with T and H, because it's the closest, we could say, well, it's something between thu and thu in English, but so it's Thessaloniki in English, we could say. But in the old times, I mean, they were called it Salonico, the Italians were called it Salonico. So they were, in fact, it was during the Ottoman periods that they started to make it, I mean, they eliminated the the, because it was very difficult to pronounce, I think, Thessaloniki, it was very long. So they were calling Saloniki, it was easier. And so in some languages, it stayed like that, Thessaloniki. And also in modern Greek now, we say sometimes Saloniki instead of Thessaloniki. And we say, we are going to Saloniki. It's a little bit more argot, something like that. Okay. No, both are correct. But I mean, the normal, the typical, the official name is Thessaloniki, which in Greek it's written by Thess. Thessaloniki.
We also have a metro program. We are dreaming about it for 70 years. And maybe now we started the beginning. So we are not the only one.
Yeah, this discussion about the metro is another big discussion that we could do, because, for example, for a city like this, with the size of Thessaloniki, I mean, most of us, we weren't even sure that we needed the metro, because with all that money, we could have until now around 5 lines of tram, for example, that it could work, or I don't know, a BRT line, to go from the airport to the railway station, and then some tram lines. And we had already constructed that because we wouldn't have also the problem with the excavations and the archaeological findings. But who listens to us? Nobody. So the mayors do whatever they want normally. The metro sounds a little bit more, something luxurious, also because we always want to, we have this kind of rival with Athens, or in Athens there is a metro, so also in Thessaloniki we have to make a metro, something like that. So, it was, in my opinion, it wasn't the wisest decision to go on with the metro before doing anything else in Thessaloniki. Because now we have nothing. The last 30 years, we have only the buses, that they don't work also very well, because during the crisis, they didn't have the money to renew the whole, the number of the buses. Now they are not so well. Well, it's been 2 years now that they started to renew it, but it's a problem because we have only the buses. And also the taxi, which is not so expensive, of course, in Greece, But lately, I mean, the prices were augmented, a little bit increased. So even the taxi now is not the ideal solution. Well, of course, we can always walk because it's not something, nothing is so far away. I mean, in 45 minutes, we can go from the one side of the city to the other side. So also we can go on walking and have this sustainable approach to. So maybe you have to make the break now, no?
I don't know if there are any questions.
Ah,
here.
yeah, yes, it's good to be with you. Oh, no,
we are
there
fine. Okay.
are. Okay.
Perfect.
So thank you. I hope that it wasn't very tiring. And I think it's time for the coffee break now. Okay. Thank you.